At first, I was skeptical of Pokopia, something which came as a surprise to me considering it looked exactly like Dragon Quest Builders. As a fan of the two Builders games, Pokemon doing an adaptation of them might as well have been targeted advertising. But something was strange. Pokopia's marketing seemed to insist on framing it as a cozy game. What could that mean? It's not that I dislike cozy games, it's just Dragon Quest Builders is not really what I would consider cozy. At least, not in the same way we would describe or think about a game like Animal Crossing. Dragon Quest Builders does not derive its appeal, at least not centrally, from a laid-back, do-whatever-you-feel-like attitude that's designed to span over the course of a few months. It doesn't have limited-time holiday events or engage in real-time mechanics at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Builders games are narrative-driven, structured experiences, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, directly guiding you where to go and what you need to do at all times. I'd argue the chapter structure is itself the key appeal of Builders. You spend some time learning the surroundings, building up a central hub, meeting the characters. Then, a few hours later, you sail off to a completely new location with new building materials and new characters with virtually nothing carrying over from the previous location. The chapter structure offers the games a steady yet satisfying progression, letting Builders ramp up the complexity of its mechanics and the dangers of its situations without overwhelming the player by trying to cram all of its ideas into one singular space. The chapter structure is Builders' attempt to adapt the vignette structure the mainline Dragon Quest games employed to great effect. It goes further. Builders games dally with combat, too. On occasion, you'll be asked to defend the chapter's hub area from an incoming onslaught. To add some tension to the battles, these hordes of mobs have the ability to demolish parts of your creation, an existential threat for a game in which the core premise is building and creating. Boss monsters cap off each chapter to pose a greater version of the same threat the hordes did. You must take advantage of each level's unique gimmicks to fend them off. Builders 2 gets a little more playful with its structure. At the halfway mark, instead of moving on to the next proper chapter, the game stages a coup and interjects a multi-hour detour to a place called Skelkatraz so it can hurl up several hours of dialogue while having you engage in menial slave labor. Oh, and you can go ahead and forget your old names. From today onwards, your numbers 6207 and 6208. Nothing like when the cozy game suddenly starts addressing me by my prison identification digits. The making of this video is how I'm learning there's a strong hatedom for Skelkatraz within the Builders 2 community. And I have to say I'm just disappointed. How can so many people hate joy and whimsy? It seems to me that Builders more straightforwardly fits the mold of a plain old linear RPG experience with a few survival elements thrown in than it does the cozy mold of Animal Crossing or even the freeform sandbox mold of Minecraft, though it certainly takes more cues from the latter than the former. The segmented chapter structures and the oops, my best friend might actually be the Antichrist just don't seem to be the kinds of things normally under the purview of these latter genres. None of this is surprising given the series Builders is spun off from. But what is important to note is that the linear narrative-focused elements that cause Builders to deviate from Animal Crossing and Minecraft are exactly the things which make them compelling experiences. This explains my trepidation towards Pokopia. It promised to be vaguely cozified Builders. It would have real-time mechanics, offering rewards for daily check-ins, hosting limited events during specific days or weeks, and time gates which encourage experiencing the main story at a slower pace. Though the trailers made it a point to talk about exploration, it was never clear what the overall progression of the game looked like. Would we be rebuilding one singular town, as we might expect from an Animal Crossing? Or would Pokopia also adopt the chapter structure that was the backbone of Builders? We would help with Pokemon's requests, but was this the main focus of the game or a side activity? A lot of emphasis was placed on multiplayer and hide and seek. Ditto, pun intended, for there being anything combat related. Indeed, that seemed the most unlikely thing of all. In the way that Builders was what it was because it built off Dragon Quest, it felt that Pokopia was taking similarly impactful cues from Pokemon. Pokemon is seen as a pleasant, friendly franchise for all ages. Thus, it would not do to have things like combat, which threaten to destroy your labored creations under any circumstance. Such things would certainly be deemed too hardcore for Pokemon's curated attitude. And that was the sinister edge of Pokopia's cozy label. There was the sense Pokopia had no choice but to be a cozy game, not because there weren't any other interesting angles to be had with the game's premise, but because anything even slightly less friendly than cozy would prove too destabilizing to Pokemon's self-image. It might challenge the series to expand its understanding of what Pokemon can and should look like. It didn't matter why Builders worked, its qualities must be haphazardly diminished to accommodate the stringent aesthetic of a Pokemon game. That's why I viewed the label with hostility. A cozified version of Dragon Quest Builders was, to me, essentially the same as saying, we've made a version of Dragon Quest Builders without the sauce. An unforced error born from Pokemon wanting to play it safe. Well, that's not very encouraging, is it? Withered Wasteland quickly allayed my concerns. The progression of the area was definitely familiar. In order to rebuild the Pokemon Center, we would need the aid of several Pokemon with specialized talents. After recruiting the Kanto starters to the task, an ongoing storyline begins about how to increase the humidity of the area and save the nearby Onix from its cage of dry, stony blocks. Onix being instrumental to our Pokemon Center project. The chain of moisture-fueled brainstorming that follows eventually leads us to Kyogre, who creates enough rain for us to dampen the grass and rocks and free our Onix. All of this is very Builders-esque. It's a series of quests that force you to remodel the environment alongside a group of characters who teach you the particulars of a specific game mechanic, in this case humidity. There weren't any Pokemon hordes trying to destroy the center, or a fight with a legendary Pokemon, but this was a promising start to be sure. Then the real moment of clarity. A few access terminals open up after our meeting with Kyogre. Upon exiting one of the terminals, we're greeted with a seaside town shrouded in thick cloud cover and dotted with a series of impotent electrical poles. Water snaked through the crevices left in the cracked tile, while nearby patches of land were drenched in crusted oil. This area was being positioned in opposition to the wasteland. Clearly, Bleak Beach was not going to have any problems with humidity. More to the point, it was clear Bleak Beach had a gimmick, light, along with a story paired to that gimmick, dispersing the dark clouds, and that both were very different from the ones present in Withered Wastelands. In other words, it was the critical to success chapter structure Pokopia refused to confirm in any of its marketing. The more time I spent with Pokopia, the more obvious it became that this was Dragon Quest Builders with the sauce. Along these lines, Pokopia has gone about tweaking and adapting the level design of a Builders chapter in thoughtful ways. Zones in Pokopia are a lot smaller than the ones in Builders, remembering that Builders 1 had to rely on colored teleporters to get you around, and Builders 2 had map-based fast travel. No such thing is necessary in Pokopia because the breadth of a level can generally be discerned within a few minutes, and many levels have shortcuts looping its different parts back around to each other. To its credit, this reduction in size isn't felt acutely. What Pokopia's zones lack in size, they make up for in density. Similar to Builders, levels are divided into sub-areas. The Withered Wastelands are deceptively small thanks to the central hub area being enclosed by a series of cliff faces. But breaking the wall in any direction leads to something fairly substantial, like the beach with Team R's tower, or the road to Pallet Town near Onix's cage. Bleak Beach has a series of cave systems hidden behind one of its access terminals, which are most easily reached by examining them from the lone islet off the coast. Of course, there's also the SS Anne's many layers to explore. Rocky Ridges keeps a majority of itself obscured underground, limestone caverns giving way to lava-filled mine shafts leading all the way up to a museum blanketed in ash. Sparkling Skylands is the most straightforward, as each sub-area is managed across 4 to 5 floating islands. Furthermore, the game smartly doles out these sub-areas as you progress. Access to each of them is punctuated by the introduction of a new mechanic or transformation. Learning Cut or Rock Smash, gaining the ability to swim as Lapras, powering up Cut or Rock Smash with food, or learning to fly as Dragonite, respectively. It's figuratively, and often literally, Pokopia's version of HMs, carrying with it the same structural benefits. This method of showing you an inaccessible area, then later giving you the ability to travel there, keeps exploration constant throughout each chapter, instead of front-loading it to whenever you first arrive. It extends the life of levels whose sites could otherwise be exhausted in a short half-hour. Standard stuff here admittedly, but it goes a long way in making even tiny levels like the ones in Pokopia feel full. None of what I've said so far actually explains why the levels in Pokopia are smaller than the ones in Builders, though. It has to do with the biggest difference between the two. While Builders focused on us modeling specific room layouts to the townspeople's satisfaction, Pokopia has us create habitats to each species of Pokemon's satisfaction. These may sound equivalent, but they turn out to be near opposites in practice. The premise of a Builders chapter was to create a fortified base for whoever happened to be living there. This was necessary because monsters and demons had overtaken the worlds of the Builders games, and they were not pleased with the humans. Consistent with the premise, room construction occurred totally within one central plot of land. Any additional rooms required as the chapter progressed would need to be fitted together minding the already built blueprints. It was sort of like a game of Tetris. We can see why Pokopia would be resistant to this format. Pokemon are far more eclectic than fantasy townspeople. There are hundreds of different species, each favoring their own unique climates, objects, and, well, habitats. It's in the name. To cram them all into the same confined square of partitions would represent this fact poorly. To that end, the habitats themselves incentivize making use of the whole level instead of one tiny piece of it. A condition like brightness will need some Pokemon to remain out in the open, while those that like darkness in caverns and grottos. The same is true for the presence of heat sources. Humidity will have some habitats near water, and others deliberately away from it. Elevation restrictions demand some habitats be built on top of cliffs or mountaintops, and unless you're planning to remodel, this basically guarantees the creation of habitats on the outskirts of some zones. The game is often heavy-handed about things. The level's different sub-areas usually feature differing conditions favorable to certain habitats. Pre-built structures within those sub-areas will contain almost complete habitats, only needing an additional patch of tall grass or the reconfiguring of an item sitting in just the wrong position. Now, you could take all of those pre-furnished items and find suitable conditions elsewhere, but that's a more cumbersome task than just finishing the job right then and there. Either way, the result is that you're unlikely to constrain your habitat building to only the space surrounding the level's Pokemon Center. Given that this is the expected behavior when habitat building, we should now see why it is essential for Pokopia to have smaller zones than Builders. You're expected to return to each Pokemon's habitat frequently. Security cameras can help tell you when a Pokemon has decided to show up in some faraway place, but that's not nearly good enough. You need to make sure they're happy too, and no amount of cameras are going to help with that. This means once you've gotten enough habitats in place, you're still going to be running laps around each level to make sure everyone's feeling alright, something which would have become nightmarish had the Builders level design philosophy been utilized. But why not then simply make big levels and then implement a robust fast travel system, one that allows you to go to any of the important sub-areas? Firstly, this would only reduce backtracking if all the necessary habitat conditions were clustered at the fast travel points, which essentially negates the whole premise of utilizing every inch of terrain by instead creating several smaller, Builders-like hubs per level. Secondly, it fails to take into account what Pokopia is doing at a broader level. Chapters and Builders were very discrete in nature, to the point where one literally had different save files for each of them, as if they were their own separate games. While 2 had a hub world acting as the connective tissue between chapters, where you access new areas via a world map, chapters were still made discrete by preventing you from carrying over any previously collected materials upon first visit. Every time you landed on a new island, you were more or less at the mercy of whatever that island asked of you. This is not the approach Pokopia takes with its chapters. Rather, interconnectivity between levels is encouraged. Pokopia de-emphasizes the actual building part of things in favor of the habitats, so most construction is left up to the Pokemon. This was reserved only for the largest structures in Builders 2. But since almost no construction is done by the player, and the projects themselves require a large quantity of Pokémon plus any special conditions, it is often necessary to bring over Pokémon from other areas. I think it's fair to say Pokopia might actually stray a little too far from Builders in this case. There's a frustrating passivity to house building, exacerbated by the fact that it takes real time for the Pokémon to complete each structure. While this does speak to the lackadaisical pace the game expects you to take it at, the time gradients for differently sized projects are non-existent. It seems that everything larger than a pile of leaves or a dank crawl space takes the Pokémon until the next calendar day to complete, no matter when it started. Coupled with the fact that you contribute nothing but raw materials, the end result of a build was never as satisfying as I hoped it would be. The mere idea of traveling between chapters is already distant from the entirely different save files of Builders 1, but it goes much further. You're able to complete Bleak Beach and Rocky Ridges in either order, starting and stopping one for the other if you so desire. I began with Bleak Beach only to end up completing the Ridges first. Most Pokémon are not tied to specific areas either, meaning you can create their spawn habitat, then later move them into another appropriately conditioned location in a completely different level. The game expects you to apply skills learned in later levels to previous ones. Think setting up generators in Withered Wasteland for the Team Initiation Challenge. Most impactfully, the game allows you to transfer items between levels, not after completing the chapter, but as soon as you get there. That last item is not always as pleasant as it sounds, though. It's perhaps one of the few times Pokopia stumbles in reinterpreting Builders. Inventory management in Pokopia is a pain. It's just impossible to keep track of where you've put all your items, in what area, in which chest. There are so many different things in this game, and little forewarning for when you're going to need what. It's often easier to recraft duplicate materials just because it's too tedious to go back to another level, check to see if any of the chests contain the items you're looking for, then make it back to the level you need to build the habitat in. None of this was an issue in Builders because of the discrete nature of its chapters. You didn't need to worry about what you'd stored in the previous level because it literally didn't matter. Those items weren't going to be accessible to begin with. But now that levels are interconnected in Pokopia, said items are fair game, and often expected. So it would have been nice if Pokopia's chest and inventory management system had been updated in response to this structural change. The solution seems easy to me. The PCs are already incredibly powerful assets in Pokopia. You're telling me they couldn't have devised some kind of cloud storage system that contained a global inventory across levels? A larger personal inventory may have alleviated some pain, but alas, even a fully upgraded inventory falls short of the 7-page bag Builders 2 provided the player with. As it is, Pokopia's inventory system is a bunch of unnecessary hurdles that don't contribute meaningfully to the experience, and reads like a holdover from a completely different game with a very different structural approach. We need only look at the endings for each game to reinforce my interconnectivity analysis. The final chapters of each Builders game took place in desolate wastelands, where resources were hard to come by. In Builders 1, the land was tainted, preventing you from collecting even usable dirt or twigs, some of the most basic items in the game. This was effective again because of the discrete nature of the chapters. You couldn't rely on the resources from previous chapters as backup, because those resources did not exist. Tantagel was an effective climax to Builders 1 precisely because it had you starting from scratch. On the other hand, Pokopia uses its final chapter to, surprise, emphasize the interconnectivity between the areas. To aid in the construction of Sparkling Skylands Tower, you're required to call upon Pikachu from the Bleak Beach and Chef Dente from the Rocky Ridges. But the game's actual final task lies in the Team Initiation Challenge, requiring you to submit items that can only be obtained once each of the previous areas has been developed to at least environmental level 5. If you weren't at least a little diligent in habitat upkeep, this means the final moments of Pokopia will have you backtracking to each of the previous locations. Creating less discrete chapters makes sense for Pokopia in much the same way the switch between room blueprints to habitats was. Builders had us defeat some great evil or belay a deadly curse at the end of each chapter. Pokopia's interests, by contrast, are benign. Each chapter sees us restore life to a land once devoid of it. But that can't be the end for Pokopia. It doesn't want us to just move on from these places and load up the next save file. Pokopia wants us to invest in the long-term well-being of the world. The environmental levels of each zone max out at 10, a whole 2 times larger than the max town level in Builders. In that way, Pokopia makes complete restoration a more intensive objective. I had worried that Pokopia was going to be watered-down Dragon Quest Builders. What I found instead was a game that had, inventory aside, carefully considered the foundations laid out by those 2 games and made something new of them, even expanding on some of Builders' concepts to make in some respects a more interesting game. In the end, Pokopia's central mission had convinced me of even the things I thought I would miss. I thought I was going to lament the lack of combat, shallow as it may have been in Builders. There was something appealing about defending my creations against a horde of monsters seeking to destroy it. Now, I'm not going to say a version of Pokopia with combat couldn't work. I think having to defend Pokemon centers from hordes of angry Tyranitar sounds like an awesome idea, but I'm forced to concede that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense in the version of Pokopia we got. The habitats are much simpler beasts than the room blueprints of Builders, building itself is de-emphasized in Pokopia, and threatening to displace a bench or a mic stand or a Dragonite plushie doesn't seem to carry the same weight as destroying your home base. The level design doesn't encourage attacks of this kind either. Notice how the towns in Builders are almost unilaterally constructed on large, flat plains, specifically to facilitate these kinds of bombardments. The only area in Pokopia that looks remotely like this is Pallet Town, but since habitat creation encourages use of the entire space anyways, the threat of damage would only apply to the habitats in the immediate vicinity of the Pokemon Center, which isn't nearly as exciting. Nor does the premise of the game even allow for such a thing to be possible. This is a world in which Pokemon who have mysteriously vanished are only now just reappearing. How can I be attacked by hordes of non-existent Pokemon? Certainly, Pokopia could stand to be a little more adventurous. I'd have liked to see the game disrupt its own formula at some point. How fun would it be to see the Pokemon version of the Skelcatraz sequence? Mostly though, I'm glad Pokopia was able to prove me wrong. I was so certain that if Dragon Quest Builders Pokemon Edition didn't have all the exact same ingredients, the sauce would be lost. Yet even when the ingredients weren't quite the same, the result was still a well-thought-out, cohesive game that happened to form a sauce of a slightly different variety. It's hard not to call that a fair trade. So far, it's been all builders, builders, builders with me. Fair enough, Builders is great. But we can't forget that Pokopia is also a Pokemon game, and a pretty interesting one at that. It has everything to do with Pokopia presenting to us the Pokemon post-apocalypse. The idea of a Poké-pocalypse is a startling choice on its face. Games like Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon toyed with such a concept, but the end of the world has remained a fixture only on the margins of the series. True, potential doomsday scenarios abound in a majority of Pokemon games, even spin-offs, but they are always something avertible, something reversible, something that only happens in other dimensions or other time frames. It's never been realized in the world we're currently inhabiting. There's a sense in which this is an intentional maneuver on Pokemon's behalf. A reason why, despite its storied history, Pokemon hasn't properly delved into the Poké-pocalypse. The notion is utterly subversive to the series' core ethos. Post-apocalypse stories are by their nature admonishments of what came before. They are warnings, cautionary tales. Fail to take notice of this, let that fester unabated, and civilization will surely collapse. If this understanding of post-apocalypse stories is correct, it's clear why Pokemon would be reluctant. The relationships between people and Pokemon are supposed to be perfect. Catching, training, battling, this is righteous. This is how Pokemon and trainer ought to show their love for each other. You cannot question this bond or how it is performed, and if you do, you are weak or ignorant or malicious or any combination of the three. Pokémon has never made it a secret that it imagines itself as utopia, and notions to the contrary are swiftly and always defeated. It is part of a Pokémon game's nature to uphold its status quo, because to do otherwise would necessitate an alteration to the mainline game's formula in some way. This is why Lily had to become a trainer at the end of Sun and Moon. It's why Scarlet and Violet busied themselves with self-aggrandizing storylines wherein it sadistically tortured a bratty kid for failing to understand Pokémon conventions and is placed with respect to those conventions. That is, beneath the player character. It's why despite the ZA Royale serving a specific purpose in saving Lumiose, Legend ZA then decided after the fact that the Royale should continue indefinitely. Because what else is Pokémon meant to do? Imagine a version of Legend ZA without the ZA Royale? The idea was literally inconceivable to that game, explaining why its DLC was also the ZA Royale with the serial numbers filed off. That's the striking thing about Pokopia. Pokopia tells us that the future of Pokémon, far after Ruby and Sapphire, Black and White, Sun and Moon, Scarlet and Violet, is this pile of rubble. A dried up, washed out, dead utopia, something even the most wondrous of technological inventions couldn't maintain. Pokopia imagines the future of Pokémon as being a place where the bond between trainer and Pokémon no longer exists. A future in which we are forced to consider whether or not this bond was as eternal as the series had claimed. That's the scandalousness of it all. To do the Poké-pocalypse is to acknowledge the possibility that the Pokémon universe has room for improvement. This is what makes Pokopia's choice to use Kanto and its many recognizable landmarks effective. Kanto is Pokémon. It is the most famous, the most recognizable, the most prestigious, the most sacred of Pokémon locations. In the hearts and minds of the oldest Pokémon fans out there, Kanto is a symbol of stability and the gateway to childhood nostalgia. That even it could fall, that even its institutions were fleeting, is the most damning statement a Pokémon game has ever made. Its ruin represents Pokémon's existential fear that even a worldwide juggernaut like itself is capable of falling out of cultural relevancy. If Kanto couldn't survive the Poké-pocalypse, it's a safe bet no other region made it either. With the slate wiped clean, Pokopia begins its work. The aim? To redesign the Pokémon world and live up to the series' lofty but largely unfulfilled promises. Pokopia dares to put into practice what the series has only ever paid lip service to. Pokémon have largely been empty vessels that tell us something about their human counterparts, but little of themselves. Any personality they have is sequestered into snippets of background lore or abstracted away into optional gameplay mechanics. Pokémon have been, in practice, fashion accessories to their owners. But in the world Pokopia seeks to build, it is finally time for Pokémon to have some dignity and respect. They are the ones granted autonomy, and what they desire is of our utmost importance. Ditto, imitating the role of the human, does not go on a rampage collecting and battling and stuffing its friends into boxes as it pleases. Instead, Ditto listens and attends to their needs. This Pokémon wants a toy, that Pokémon wants a bed, this other one needs some food. This is unlike any human I've ever played as in a Pokémon game. It is, however, the kind of caring, nurturing relationship the series has always wanted us to believe was happening in the background. Aiding in our mission to give Pokémon autonomy is their newfound ability to speak, or at least our newfound ability to understand it. No longer must a Pokémon communicate through a short cry, or desires be relayed secondhand by crazed, green-haired cult leaders. No, in Pokopia's utopia, the Pokémon will express their personalities explicitly. This is done to varying degrees of success. On the less interesting side of the spectrum, non-story-related Pokémon are often only given a few lines of specialized dialogue before they fall into a pool of mostly stock sentences. Their speech patterns seem to be related to the size and general vibe of the species. A lot of larger, more intimidating Pokemon speak with this southern drawl like they're from Alabama. Other species like to say yo a lot. Reckon I couldn't tell you why. It's probably unreasonable to expect a whole suite of unique prompts and messages for all the 300 Pokemon in Pokopia, but even a little more specialization in their dialogue could go a long way. For this class of Pokemon, personality is primarily represented through the specifics of the habitats they desire, most of which stick close to the few things said about them from previous Pokemon games. On the flip side, the story-related Pokemon fare much better, thanks to the quests associated with them that can be specific about that Pokemon's needs, like a Dragonite wanting 5 different alarm clocks to wake them up on time. Special variants of species like Smearguru, Pikachu, or Tinkmaster are the premier instances, because it's Pokopia freeing itself from the lore shackles and creating unique characters to fit its own interests. These variants are additive to Pokemon instead of being referential, the place where a majority of Pokopia's personalities reside because it relies so heavily on the Pokédex for inspiration. In the same way a good mystery dungeon character could make itself the dominant interpretation of any future instances of that Pokemon species, whenever I see a Tangrowth from now on, I'm likely to think of Professor Tangrowth first and foremost. Pokopia isn't done just yet. Consider how its new vision for Pokemon reinterprets the institution of catching. One of the core appeals of catching was the process of the encounter, the suspense associated with entering a new route and wondering, what new Pokemon will I find here? This impulse alone has launched tens of thousands of Nuzlockes over the decades. Closely related to that is the ostensible experience offered by version differences. I caught A and B Pokemon, but my friend on a different version caught B and C. We should communicate and swap. Strewn about the levels, or by visiting Dream Islands, you can acquire habitat information for different kinds of Pokemon other people won't have. In tutorial tips, the game not so subtly suggests visiting your friends and showing off your unique Mons. You never know exactly what habitat you'll be learning about, and thus what Pokemon you'll be inviting in, and 2 players are unlikely to have exactly the same group of Pokemon available to them as the game proceeds. Notice then that Pokopia has effectively recreated the dynamics of Pokemon catching, but in a way that's dramatically easier to square with the series' ethos. Keeping in mind that Pokemon has oft viewed the relationship between trainer and Pokemon as akin to parent and child, we no longer have to conjure up explanations for why squishing Pokemon into Pokeballs and hoarding them in PCs and casually trading them between people is exactly like how parents treat their children when you really think about it. Explanations with this aim, especially officially endorsed ones, are never convincing because no amount of "the Pokemon enjoy it actually" covers for the transparent fact that they are post hoc rationalizations meant to justify gameplay mechanics. Fine enough, but it doesn't exactly make for a compelling or cohesive setting. On the other hand, catching a Pokemon because you've built a habitat they love requires no further explanation because it's perfectly intuitive. It's not blatantly coercive, and even if you decide to shove a bunch of legendaries into a barren shack, they're still free to wander around instead of whatever lore we came up with this week to explain what a PC box does. The way Pokemon are utilized in Pokopia is so obvious yet so foreign to the series writ large. When we see a water-type Pokemon, we're trained to know its purpose is to shoot water gun at an opponent, or some equivalent. But in Pokopia, it shoots water gun not at an opponent, but at a patch of grass to liven it up. Conkeldurr's Pokédex entry claims it taught humans how to mix together concrete some 2,000 years ago. Only now in Pokopia do we get to see that in action. Beforehand, I would have never been able to tell you a Conkeldurr could do this, because the only thing I've seen a Conkeldurr do is mix together another Pokemon's guts. Tinkaton gets to use that oversized hammer as an engineer who wants to tackle huge projects, not as a menace who likes to inflict blunt force trauma on armored birds. Greedent gets to be a gourmet chef. Zorua likes to trick Pokemon with illusions, not trick Pokemon. Okay, well that one really hasn't changed. This is legitimately mind-blowing stuff. In Pokopia, the Pokemon world starts to make sense. We've been told time and time again that humans and Pokemon build society together, but it's never been clear how that's actually the case, because all Pokemon seem to be good for is shattering each other into a million splinters. Pokemon has tried to imbue a double life to these creatures through the Pokédex, articulating how they might behave in nature or by describing their dispositions, but this method can only go so far given that we're never privy to these supposed second lives otherwise. Yet as we've seen, Pokopia is one of the few times where Pokemon has not only attempted, but foregrounded the realities implied by the Pokédex. The series is richer for it. Every time a Bulbasaur sprouts up a few new grass blades, or a Piplup clears up some tar, Pokopia demonstrates how Pokemon have contributed and harmonized with the human world other than as their pastime entertainment. An uncharitable reading of my desire for Pokemon is that I want them to completely strip out any semblance of battling, and turn this franchise into nothing but a series of Hope-core, Pokemon-oriented coffee shop alternate universes. Now, am I incredibly upset that the actual Hope-core, Pokemon-oriented coffee shop alternate universe turned out to be a match puzzler mobile game? Yes I am, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that, beyond my initial chafing at the cozy label, there does seem to be something undeniably pointed about Pokopia's insistence to forego any sort of combat. After all, Pokopia was able to align the theory and practice of catching so adeptly. Could it not attempt the same elsewhere? Shouldn't battling have a place in Pokopia's vision of a more perfect Pokemon? The answer to that question may very well be no. For 3 decades, the series has said that Pokemon respect nothing more than the thrill of a good battle. They grow from it, physically and emotionally. But that's not at all what we see in Pokopia. For the first time in this universe, Pokemon are allowed to speak. And what do they have to say? Well, it seems like they have virtually nothing to say about battling. Dartrix seems more excited by the new perch I got it than it does the possibility of spamming Razor Leaf. Scorbunny seems more interested in my toy blocks than it does flame-wheeling its nearest neighbor. If Pokemon really like battling so much, you'd think they'd get around to mentioning it a little more often than they do. Pokopia shows us a world where most Pokemon don't care about battling. In this way, Pokopia suggests to us the true nature of the Poké-pocalypse, the thing Pokemon needed to improve to avoid its demise. While the series spoke of cooperation and friendship, it likewise indulged in a systematic disregard for its creatures. A world that nominally extolled their importance, but could not muster in 30 years the courage to give them a voice with a distinct perspective. Instead, their likes and demands were entirely dictated by their human masters. Yes, of course we love being inside Pokeballs. Yes, of course we love battling, even though we never actually speak about it given our own volition. To remedy this injustice, Pokopia argues that a better world is the one that finally gives Pokemon the keys to their own universe. A world where they're free to convey their own will, have their own habitats, build their own communities, laugh alongside their own neighbors. It's something worth considering. These days, the evidence quite literally speaks for itself. Oh, you thought we were done? Oh, no. Remember, Pokopia is still a Pokemon game at heart, which means it's contractually obligated to have an ending that makes me upset. So let's get this over with. At first blush, the ending to Pokopia is perfect. It's become clear at this point the rocket conducting the team initiation challenge is our best lead on finding out what happened to the humans. If we can simply complete its ho-hum assignments, we'll get all the answers we've been looking for. But then the game pulls the rug out from under us. Tangrowth decides to set off some party poppers as a reward for our successful induction into Team R. The rocket takes the gesture as an act of hostility, immediately blasting off to avoid any incoming threat that might hinder its mission. The Pokemon can only watch as the light from its engines soars into the atmosphere, taking our lead with it. There's an intimacy to this ending that fits the game well. It's not a big celebration or happy reunion tour. Pokopia ends with a goofy little accident made by two creatures who barely know what they're doing. However, our inability to grasp the rocket's true nature was not failure. It led us to plant the seeds of new life and rehabilitate the desolate land around us. Pokopia fades to black in a moment of ambiguity. Do you suppose there's any chance that humans are seeing that building out there somewhere? Tangrowth wonders. They may not. The Pokemon can't be sure. The only thing they can do is continue to build the kind of world they want to live in. If only that were it, but Pokopia can't leave well enough alone. The credits show the rocket flying into the reaches of space, until it at last reaches a ship, with a distinctly humanoid figure emerging from its interior. Okay, well, great. I guess we have an answer to Tangrowth's question now. The humans are definitely seeing that building out there somewhere. But then it gets worse. After the credits, a magic tablet appears next to Ditto, with a rather lengthy message. It reads in part, "We even have more than enough fuel to make it back to the planet easily after the environment's calmed down a bit. The boss's plan is absolutely perfect. The boss says that the scale of the plan to get all humans into outer space at once is just too large. He said that if anything goes seriously wrong, the others might not have enough fuel to get back. Maybe we could share some of our extra fuel with them if that happens. Then maybe people'd think, oh, Team R is actually so nice, and we get more people wanting to join up." If I were reviewing this game for an outlet, I'd knock off a whole point from its perfect score just because of this stinky iPad. What's the problem? Consider the hacker's confession logs that are scattered throughout Pokopia's levels. In the last one, the hacker writes, "But for humanity to survive in space for any length of time, it would take a tremendous amount of energy. I calculated that even a slight deviation from the original plan would result in insufficient energy to return, leaving humankind stranded in space for dozens or even hundreds of years. With this information in mind, we can now see the magic iPad for what it really is. It's not a fun lore tidbit to close out the game. The purpose of the iPad is to implode any remaining ambiguity within the story and assuage the audience's fears. It completes the picture started by the hacker. The humans cannot return because they ran out of fuel. Team R's rocket is the only way the humans can get enough fuel. We just saw Team R's rocket reach the humans in the credits. The syllogism is complete. Its conclusion? The humans will be coming back, and they and their Pokemon will be reunited. You don't need to be sad anymore. We've given you the perfect happy ending." Why should the game feel the need to do this? It's because I fear I've gravely misinterpreted Pokopia. Take a look at what Tangrowth says after you beat the game. "Thanks to all your hard work, Pokemon have returned, and all the towns look so nice you'd hardly recognize them. You could keep improving the environment for the Pokemon here, or make habitats so more new Pokemon can join us. Honestly, I think you're best off just doing whatever you feel like. I'll admit I was shocked when that building on the beach flew off, but as I watched it go, I got the feeling that humans are coming back someday. So we can just take it easy and wait for their return." What a strange statement to let Tangrowth get away with saying. He's essentially just told us that it doesn't matter what we choose to do, because the humans will come back to fix everything up for us anyways. As if the reason we did anything in this game was solely to appease the humans. This statement is consistent with the perspective Tangrowth has carried throughout the game. Whenever we engage in a new project, the justification is always about the humans. We need to rebuild the Pokemon centers to impress them. We need to make rocky ridges more lively so that humans will find it more palatable. We need to brighten Bleak Beach for the same reason. Tinkmaster and Tangrowth have this discussion regarding the tower in Sparkling Skylands. I bet that'd surprise the humans so much they'd come back to check it out. I suppose it is possible the humans might notice and come back. Even apart from that, if we Pokemon really could rebuild such a thing all on our own, wouldn't that be exciting? The problem is that there's something obviously wrong with Tangrowth's perspective, and Pokopia has been all too happy to point it out to us. It's painfully naive. We rebuild the Pokemon centers, the humans don't return. We throw a party in the rocky ridges, the humans don't take notice. The shroud over Bleak Beach is lifted, the humans don't care. The tower at the center of Sparkling Skylands is fully refurbished, the humans remain silent. None of this is working. But to Tangrowth, it doesn't seem to matter. They just need to keep at it. One more party, one more Pokemon Center, surely. 99% of Pokemon quit building right before they summon the humans back. Tangrowth treats humans like they're pet owners who've spurned him for bad behavior, or like he's a child who thinks he's responsible for his parents' divorce. If he can just impress them enough, he can win them back. All the while, Ditto collects more and more logs from the humans' final days, records of their plan for self-preservation. And the truth of the matter becomes plain. Humans didn't spurn Pokemon. Pokemon were their sacrifice, and the events of the game are living proof they're no longer watching. No Pokemon Center in the universe is going to bring them back because, as the hacker's confessions revealed, they are literally incapable of returning. Tangrowth's plans were doomed from the start. He just doesn't realize it because he cannot even conceive of the problem's true size and scale. The character arc for Tangrowth should be clear, right? Tangrowth's naivete needs to be challenged. He needs to come face to face with the idea that no matter what is built, the humans might never return to see it. Does that then mean the Pokemon shouldn't bother building at all? At the start, Tangrowth might say yes. If we are to restore the world, we need humanity. That's why he proposes Pokemon emulate them, by walking, talking, acting, living like them. That's the only possible path to success. But as the huts are furnished and the parties are thrown, and humans continue to have zero input on their planet's future, a different answer to the question begins to emerge. He sees the Pokemon repopulating the Earth, the enjoyment they get from interacting with their new friends. And when the confrontation finally happens, when his last chance to learn of the humans blasts off into space, that's okay. Because now he's learned there's another reason to rebuild. Not for the humans' sake, but for the Pokemon living here and now. Except that's not what happens in Pokopia. The ending fully vindicates Tangrowth's naivete. If you build just the right things, you'll be given just the right materials to launch just the right rocket that just so happens to give the humans exactly what they need to make it home. Building the Pokemon centers did help bring the humans back, without us ever realizing it, and Tangrowth's foolhardy plan was secretly genius, allowing him to drunkenly stumble into the correct answer the same way he got that rocket launched. Raising the environment levels for each area was a necessary step in reaching that goal. Filtered in this way, Pokopia reveals what it was all about. Making a new home for Pokemon was subordinate to ensuring the humans get back to where they belong, a means to an end. We have to ask ourselves why we should think humans returning is a good thing. It defies the very nature of Pokopia's premise. It relates to what I said earlier. The appeal of a post-apocalyptic setting is to reevaluate civilization from first principles, to look at the rubble around you and ask, what do we take from its ashes? In Pokopia, the world was ravaged by natural disasters, forcing humans to leave. Now humans are coming back, and then what? What is the world going to look like after they've returned? Are the humans going to move back into their old houses, scoop the Pokemon out of their custom habitats and stuff them back into their Pokeballs to live life just the way it was before? Is that supposed to be a happy ending? What reason do we have to believe the same exact natural disasters won't reoccur, starting the whole thing over again? The trick here is that the answer cannot simply be better technology will prevent it next time. It needs to form a coherent thematic argument. What was morally wrong with human society that they could not prevent these disasters the first time? Telling us that the humans are coming back as blatantly as the iPad does forces us into a conversation Pokopia clearly doesn't want to have. The game never gives an answer as to how future Poké-pocalypses will be prevented, which would be fine if the humans were not coming back, because the answer to what do we take from its ashes would be sufficiently built into the game's core conceit. We would know the natural disasters won't reoccur because the world that Ditto and Tangrowth are designing is completely different than the one that came before. This is a world built by and for Pokemon, not humans, and will thus be subject to different follies and foibles. The game will have given us an implicit answer here. But since the humans are coming back, this can no longer be our assumption. The onus now falls onto Pokopia to provide us an explicit answer, to tell us what is going to be different about the Pokemon world before and after the events of the game. Will humans change their behavior? The only other alternative is to believe the natural disasters were completely random, unforeseeable tragedies that could not have been stopped or prevented beforehand. If so, we won't need to worry about whether the Pokemon world changes after the humans arrive, because it doesn't matter. Human behavior and the natural disasters are just two unrelated phenomena. So we see it as the specific combination of not knowing any details about the disasters and also guaranteeing us humans will come back that leads to Pokopia's emotionally inert finale. If even one of these two variables were different, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Vindicating Tangrowth's initial perspective is a weak choice for Pokopia because all Tangrowth wants is the restoration of a halcyon past, where humans and Pokemon lived harmoniously. Until, of course, those pesky hurricanes and earthquakes that symbolize nothing appeared. Pokopia is a post-apocalypse story that spends 30 hours having you walk across the tattered, decayed corpse of society and says, "You know what we really need to do? Rebuild the fallen civilization exactly as it was." There's a reason why stories about fallen civilizations never take this position, and you'd think Pokopia would know better. Tangrowth claims that we've gotten Pokemon to emulate humans somehow, but he is self-evidently wrong. Pokemon have only emulated how they think humans behaved. Ditto takes the form of a human, but it isn't quite right. The details are off, the proportions out of whack. Ditto cannot remember exactly what its trainer looked like, so the best it can do is recreate this false imitation of a human. Whether it's good or bad is immaterial. It is, however, different. This is the naivete of Tangrowth's point of view. The idea that you can return to what came before without in some way changing it. I mean, Tangrowth can't even remember what half of the human artifacts he appraises were used for. How can Pokopia try to deny this truth? This whole business contradicts one of Pokopia's strongest elements. There's a sort of melancholy that paints the emotional experience of the game. Exploring each of the levels only to find the remnants of unfulfilled dreams sparks the imagination. Pokopia's version of Kanto is tranquil, beautiful even, but there's always the unmistakable presence of something that used to be. I don't need them to tell me that humans are never coming back, but I do reproach the game for its unwillingness to humor ambiguity. There is something hollow in the game's decision to force-feed us emotionally comforting answers under the guise of satisfaction. It makes the Poké-pocalypse feel smaller, more insignificant than it once did, and the cost of the human's departure all the less impactful. Most depressingly, it taints the metatextual flavoring that made Pokopia striking. This game is filled with references, some to other mainline Pokemon games, sure, but it indisputably centers on the first generation. Why? I thought we found the answer. It was to demonstrate that nothing can be taken for granted, that even the most well-guarded, historied institutions can be subject to collapse. But the iPad changes things. What weight is there in seeing uprooted Kanto if they're just going to promise it all back? No, there's a different narrative at play here. Pokopia is courting lapsed Pokemon fans, those who started at the beginning, but for one reason or another fell off along the way. These are the humans who flew to space, who left their Pokemon behind with nary an explanation. Pokopia expresses Pokemon's desire to bring these lapsed fans back into the fold, to give them the missing fuel they needed. A chance to reconnect with the creatures they used to love, and maybe meet some new ones they missed along the way. How will Pokemon make sure these fans don't leave again? I'm not sure. Pokopia never tells. Maybe it's as simple as jangling nostalgic Kanto references at them. If this is truly Pokemon's goal, then I can only offer an opposing perspective. Telling your audience that the world of your latest game is constructed primarily to reward millennials for their long-term fandom investment is just about the last thing our cultural moment is asking for. It is the operating force behind the endless supply of franchise revitalizations and Hollywood legacy sequels in the past decade. We do not live in the 90s anymore. In fact, it is this exact attitude which, if sustained, will be what leads to Pokemon's downfall. For a franchise to stay relevant, it must be willing to transform and try new things no matter how ill-fitting they may seem. A thriving franchise is the one in which even the most essential components remain up for negotiation. Pokopia demonstrates that well, by taking the decrepit structures Pokemon has never thought to question, and delivering us something more congruous in its place. Yes, if Pokemon wants to avoid the Poké-pocalypse, it must be interested in cultivating new audiences, not reclaiming old ones. And if Pokopia is to leave any lasting legacy at all, let it be this. Maybe it's okay to let some people go.